Members of the committee, it's an honor to be able to come here today and speak before you. And to the Gold Star families, it's an honor to be in your presence. It truly is. My name is Command Sergeant Major Jake Smith. I use my rank and title only to identify myself and my position to speak on this matter. I testify before you not as official representative of the United States Army, but as a citizen. I must preface my testimony by making it abundantly clear that I am not here to place blame on any organization or individual for the result of our nation's end days in Afghanistan. It is not my place as a soldier to do so. It is merely my duty to present this committee with the facts I know to be true so that you may make a well-informed decision. I want to make it known that I have little insight into the overarching strategic planning of the Afghanistan withdrawal. My area of expertise comes from the tactical planning and execution of the closure of Bagram Air Base and the recommendations I made to members of the U.S. Embassy in Kabul regarding a non-combatant evacuation. I will stick to the facts and circumstances I personally witnessed and offer minimal personal opinion. I very respectfully ask that any questions you ask of me keep to the facts of the matter and shy away from any personal beliefs or opinions I may hold. From October 11th, 2020 to 2 July 2021, I served as the Area Support Group for Afghanistan, or ASG, Command Sergeant Major. The duties and responsibilities of ASG included all base life support functions for the remaining 9 U.S. military installations in Afghanistan. These functions included billeting, dining facilities, public works, sanitation, and emergency response. Of particular importance to my testimony is my understanding of the life support capabilities of Bagram and HKIA. In May 2021, I was given the additional duty to serve as the Bagram Senior Enlisted Advisor. This duty included the oversight of all force protection measures and entry control points on Bagram. Of particular importance to my testimony was my understanding of the security posture of Bagram and its capabilities. It was sometime in the spring that we received the first tentative date to work towards in finalizing our Go to Zero effort, September 11th, 2021. The order came to begin to close all the smaller bases, but 2 were left in question, Bagram and HKIA. For those 2 installations, there was a looming question of whether or not they would close. Part of General Miller's guidance was to maintain order, discipline, and dignity as we collapsed. We would not just up and leave. We would hand over exceptionally orderly bases to the Afghan government. We were instructed to get as small as we could, but still function on the chance that Bagram would be used in future efforts. This presented a significant issue to Bagram as we could not collapse to the point of inoperability. We would have to have the personnel vital to running power, security, and sanitation. If we began to close the base infrastructure too aggressively, we would not be able to function and maintain security on Bagram if it was to remain open. It was sometime in March or April that I first met with planners from the U.S. Embassy. 4 planners came to Bagram to conduct a site survey to determine if Bagram was the appropriate spot to conduct a non-combatant evacuation. In this conversation, I was told that HKIA would be the other option. Prior to this meeting, I had reviewed the contingency plan for a NEO that had been created years prior. The contingency plan accounted for 45,000 to 50,000 persons that would need to be evacuated. It was members of the embassy team who informed me that the actual number would be anywhere from 120,000 to 140,000. I advised the embassy team against using HKIA for the following reasons. Bagram could house 35,000 people without overloading the infrastructure, whereas HKIA could only hold roughly 3,000. HKIA was a shared airfield. It was not completely controlled by the military. It had significant weak points in the security. Bagram had a completely secure airfield that would require a massive military offensive to overrun or breach. HKIA was surrounded by the city of Kabul and has 4.4 million residents. If there was to be a fight, it would be in an urban environment and exceptionally difficult to undertake and control. Bagram had a small town on the western edge and open terrain in the majority of the north, east, and west. Movement of any kind could be detected, controlled, or eliminated very early. The defendability of Bagram was exponentially greater than that of HKIA. Bagram held the logistical capability to meet the requirements of 130,000 people. Bagram had over 35,000 bed spaces and could create more using cots within the airfield hangars if necessary. Bagram had 4 dining facilities and food that could have fed those fleeing. Bagram had tens of thousands of gallons of potable water and on-site water purification capabilities. HKIA did not. Bagram had a Role 3 hospital, meaning that it had the greatest life-saving capability of any hospital remaining in Afghanistan. HKIA had a Role 2 hospital, meaning that it had a degraded capability to that of Bagram. Finally, Bagram had 4 industrial-sized incinerators. It had 2 industrial-sized material shredders. It had the mechanical capability to destroy sensitive equipment on an industrial scale in a short amount of time. HKIA did not. When I laid out all my points to the site survey team, they verbally agreed with my assessment. I met twice more with the site survey team, once in May and once in June. In these meetings, I inquired about the offensive the Taliban had launched in May and the increasing ground they controlled. I asked if the NEO was going to be held in Bagram due to the Taliban's rapid advance that indicated an assault on Kabul. The team acknowledged the ground the Taliban had gained, but offered little insight as to the decision-making process at the embassy. On or about June 14th, we were given the order to close Bagram by July 4th, well short of the originally planned date of September 11th. HKIA would remain open and provide a quick reaction force to the embassy located approximately 4 driving miles away. This was to be an enduring mission. All talks of conducting a NEO were ceased. It is my understanding that those in the embassy believed that the Taliban would not advance to take Kabul and a NEO was unnecessary. I exited as one of the final conventional forces in Bagram on 2 July 2021. My thoughts stayed with the forces that would stay on the ground as the Taliban controlled about 50% of Afghanistan on the day I departed. One single U.S. infantry company, Charlie Company 431 Infantry, 10th Mountain Division, led by Captain Swayze Brown and First Sergeant Andrew Kelly, protected HKIA for approximately 6 weeks before things began to unravel in mid-August. An area once protected by hundreds of soldiers and contractors was now protected by 113 American soldiers and 2 companies of our Turkish partner forces. Approximately 430 other U.S. service members in logistics, maintenance, air defense, and service roles also occupied HKIA. This was the only force left in Afghanistan. I will offer this final bit of opinion. The mission asked of this company and the subsequent Marines, soldiers, airmen, sailors, and coalition forces called to reinforce the small security contingent was monumental. The military executed this mission and the closure of Afghanistan with honor, integrity, and dignity. There's no force in the world that have executed such a chaotic and difficult mission better than our U.S. and coalition forces did under the direst of circumstances. They were asked to control absolute panic and anarchy, and they somehow did it. I thank every single one of them for our sacrifice to our great nation. Thank you for allowing me to speak here today.
Thank you, Command Sergeant Major. We're now going to move to questions. I'm going to begin by recognizing Chairman of the full committee, Chairman McCall, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me first again acknowledge the Gold Star families here, and I want to thank the 3 witnesses for your moral courage and clarity in your testimony here today. There's an old adage: if you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. Benjamin Franklin, first chairman of this committee, Continental Congress. He was right. There was no plan. If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. We have uncovered that there was a request that came from State Department to the Defense Department for an evacuation plan. However, that came on August 17th, 2 days after the fall of Afghanistan, the fall of Kabul, 4 days after our embassy was evacuated. And yet the president says we're planned for all contingencies. I think Colonel Crummick, you eloquently talked about how he recklessly disregarded his own National Security Council, his own generals and the intelligence community that we were being briefed at the same time while we saw this rosy narrative by state and yet this dire warning by the rest, the DOD and the intelligence community. And the result was this complete debacle and failure. And so, Colonel Crummick, my first question is to you. Was there a plan? Did you ever see an evacuation plan?
Thank you for the question. Chairman, the way the process works for planning is we'll get an initial guidance that we need to come up with courses of action. So CENTCOM, US4A, built a number of courses of action that were very different. They were very unique in each, characteristics of each one. It could be timeline, it could be conditions, troop levels, and then the senior military members. And
Colonel, could you pull that microphone a little bit closer? Thank you.
Thank you. So the senior commanders then will pick one and give them a recommendation and explain why that is. Now, feeding into this is also the intelligence community. So this is part operations, part intelligence, and they'll lay out, hey, this is the plan we think we should take. And in this case, General Milley, General Miller, General McKenzie all recommended we should not do the withdrawal until conditions are met, because violence had risen in Afghanistan, and their concern was the timing was wrong. This isn't going to give our allies a chance to be able to react accordingly to the Taliban offensive.
So in the 2 minutes, I just want to drill this down because,
Sure.
Yeah, there was a recommendation, and you talked about the failure to meet the Doha Agreement, but the president disregarded that, ignored that. He disregarded the advice of his DOD and IC and National Security Council. Was there ever an evacuation plan? Did you see, I know there's discussions, did you ever see an evacuation plan?
I did not. The discussions were going on at this high level. The problem was those that would need to actually plan and rehearse it were extremely busy. I think Sergeant Major captured it eloquently of how busy and how few service members we had on the ground. They were not in a position to be able to plan and rehearse.
Now, we've issued several subpoenas. I have not seen an evacuation plan. If they had it, I think they would have produced it to this committee. And this led to the chaos. Who was in charge? We heard Sergeant Tyler Vargas Andrew testify that he had the suicide bomber in his sights, but they didn't know what the rules of engagement were, for God's sakes. I mean, there's no plan. There are rules of engagement are confusing at best. They don't know what they are. Did you know what the rules of engagement were?
I was not on the ground, so I can't speak to the specific rules of engagement. I know the military had a clear leadership position of who was in charge on the ground. What was lacking, from my perspective, was a Department of State leadership on the ground.
So when I asked who was in charge, if you have an evacuation plan, state takes over the evacuation, correct? Prior to that, the DOD is in charge, but nobody knows who's really in charge because there's no plan in place. And guess what? The Taliban takes over. My last question. The rules of engagement are confusing at best. You have mentioned a defensive strike would be a rule of engagement. If you saw a description of the suicide bomber, along with your sniper team who confirmed this is the suicide bomber, would the rules of engagement provide that you could take out the threat as a defensive strike?
If I saw the suicide bomber and I saw the threat, I would absolutely kill that suicide bomber.
And yet when he contacts his commanding officer who we're going to interview, he says, I don't have that authority. And they ask, who does have that authority? He goes, I don't know. I'll have to get back to you. And in the interim time, guess what? The bomb goes off, killing 13 servicemen and women, 160 Afghans, injuring 45 additional U.S. servicemen and women. Massive. Because one man says you don't have permission to engage. We're going to follow up on that chain, but I think it all results because there's confusion on the ground. Nobody knows what the plan is, and nobody knows who is in charge. Yes, sir.
Sir, if I could just build on that. I think the point that you're making, that there's nobody in charge, is exactly right. There's nobody functionally in charge of our wars on the ground in theater. So what happens, if I could just draw a quick picture, is we deploy to combat zones in bureaucratic silos. So you've got the president and then National Security Council beneath them, of course. And then you've got these different bureaucratic silos, so it could be DOD, state, aid, the IC with their different silos, and there's nobody in charge of this group on the ground. And had there been somebody in charge of this group on the ground, then what you would have seen is a plan that not only synchronized the military withdrawal, but also the evacuation. So until we get this problem fixed, we actually have somebody in charge on the ground of our wars, we're going to continue to have high risk of these kind of disasters.
I agree. And by law, they're required to come up with a plan, and they did not. And that's the point the chairman's made over and over. And I thank you for indulging me.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for your responses. Ranking Member Crow is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you all for your testimony and opening. I just wanted to provide a little bit of context here, and I want to ask a few quick questions, starting with both Colonel Crumrich and Colonel Kalinda. From 2016 to 2021, are you aware that the Taliban had increased its control of territory every year for those consecutive 5 years? Colonel Crumrich?
Yes.
Colonel Kalinda?
Yes, absolutely.
Are you aware of any indications in that 5-year period that the Taliban was internally involved in discussions that indicated that they would be willing to enter into a peace agreement with the government of Afghanistan, or that they believed that continued combat operations was the key to success? Either one of you.
Their participation in the Doha Agreement would...
I'm not talking about the participation. I'm talking about intelligence indicating whether or not the Taliban really believed that the path to success for them was a negotiated peace agreement, or whether they were going to continue to press combat operations.
I don't have visibility on the specific intelligence that would lead to their thinking.
Okay.
Mr. Ranking Member, I can provide some insight on that.
Yeah,
so,
please. Mm-hmm.
In 2017 and 2018, I was in my personal capacity, I was outside of government at that point. I was involved in some Track 2 discussions with the Taliban leaders, their version of diplomats who were in Doha, and then relayed.
You can be succinct here because I have a bunch of other questions.
Yep.
Just answer the question if you can.
When the United States removed the timeline, the Taliban, at least their diplomats, said, we want to start talks because we don't want our country, to use their words, to turn into another Syria.
Okay, so who started those talks, and what president agreed to the Doha Agreement?
Those talks started in 2018, I believe, under President Trump.
Okay. And after that agreement was executed, did the Taliban largely stop attacking U.S. soldiers on the ground in Afghanistan?
Yes.
And then after the Taliban stopped attacking soldiers on the ground in Afghanistan, U.S. soldiers, did that allow us to then reduce troop numbers?
I'll answer that. So
yeah.
There were 7 provisions.
I just answer the question. After the Taliban stopped offensive operations against U.S. military in Afghanistan, then did that allow us to reduce troop numbers?
It did.
Okay. And then when did that troop reduction start?
The specific date? Roughly speaking.
Mm-hmm.
I know that we had started reducing troop numbers after the Doha Agreement. Regardless, the Taliban were not meeting the conditions required of them for us to be doing those withdrawals. And at a certain point, there was discussion with
we started in 2020, correct?
Correct.
Largely, drastically reducing troop numbers in 2020.
We did,
okay.
and we were moving.
Okay. The next question. Are you aware of a provision that me, Mr. Waltz, and Ms. Cheney passed in the 2020 NDAA cycle that would restrict the ability of the Trump administration to reduce troop levels below 2,000 unless certain conditions and certain planning and reports were made to Congress? Are you aware of that provision?
I'm not, but I'm glad you did.
Okay. Well, this passed. It became law. Are you aware that President Trump, in early January, weeks before the transition of the presidency, actually waived that provision so that he could reduce numbers below 2,000?
I know there was a discussion to bring the troops below 2,000, and I know General Milley and senior military commanders advised him not to do it, and they rescinded that order.
So he did it, correct?
He did, then it was rescinded.
There were numbers drop below 2,000 due to a presidential waiver in January 2021, correct? Or if you're not aware, then just say you're not aware.
I would have.
Well, that is true. If we had not withdrawn by the end of August of 2021, is it? I want to hear from each of you very briefly. Is it your belief that the Taliban would have resumed combat operations against U.S. soldiers, U.S. troops on the ground? Colonel Kermrich.
I believe if we had not pulled out by that date, that they would have had a hard time once the winter started to be able to actually execute that, which would have given the Afghan government the time and space to get their feet set.
Your testimony is that you believe the Taliban would not have resumed combat operations against the United States in the fall of 2021.
As long as there was negotiations going at the Taliban, we were telegraphing what our timeline would be. I believe that they would have respected it. It was the only thing they did out of the entire Doha agreement.
Colonel Kalinda?
I think if we did not talk with them and coordinate a new date, and it looked like we were violating our end of the agreement, then I believe the Taliban would have resumed attacks.
Sergeant Major Smith?
Sir, respectfully, I don't have enough information, and I'm not in a position to give my opinion on this matter.
And had they resumed attacks, which most of the intelligence shows they would we have been able to adequately defend ourselves with the roughly 1,000 troops we had, or would we have had to have added troops on the ground? Would we have had to have surged into Afghanistan again? Colonel Kermrich.
My recommendation would have been to add all the force protection required.
So we would have had to have added troops.
Right, I wouldn't call it a surge.
Colonel Kalinda.
I agree, Mr. Ranking Member, that we would have most likely have had to add troops in order to protect ourselves.
Sergeant Major Smith.
Sir, again, I do not have enough information to speak educatedly.
My point here is there was a really, really hard decision that had to be made, that President Biden made, choosing from extremely difficult alternatives that would have potentially caused more conflict and more combat operations through 2021 into the present. Thank you for the additional time. I yield back.